The world has reached a dangerous point where threats are no longer just words. When a nation like Iran publicly warns that it could strike a U.S. military base, the stakes instantly shift from political posturing to the possibility of real military conflict. The reason this matters so much is not just because of the threat itself, but because of what it signals: a major escalation in a long-running rivalry, one that has already seen decades of proxy wars, covert operations, and repeated confrontations in the Middle East. This is not a small issue. It is a direct challenge to U.S. power and influence in the region. Iran's threats often come from a place of deep strategic insecurity. The country has spent years feeling surrounded by hostile forces. The U.S. military presence in the Gulf, sanctions that cripple its economy, and rival nations like Israel and Saudi Arabia pushing back against its influence. Iran's leaders see themselves as defending a revolutionary system that has survived for more than 4 decades, and they believe that showing strength is the only way to prevent internal collapse. When Tehran threatens a U.S. base, it is sending a message not only to America, but to its own population. We are not weak, and we will not back down. However, the problem with this kind of threat is that it can easily spiral out of control. When a nation publicly claims it might attack a U.S. base, it forces the United States into a difficult position. If the U.S. ignores the threat, it risks appearing weak and emboldening Iran and its allies. If it responds too aggressively, it could trigger a war that spreads across the entire region. That is why these statements are dangerous. They create a pressure cooker situation where every move becomes more dangerous than the last. From Iran's perspective, targeting a U.S. base might seem like a powerful statement. The U.S. military presence in the Middle East is a symbol of American power and its ability to influence events in the region. For Iran, hitting a base could be framed as retaliation or defense, but for the United States, a direct attack on a base would be viewed as a major act of aggression. It would likely trigger a response that could include airstrikes, naval action, and possibly a larger military campaign. The problem is that once a military action starts, it becomes extremely difficult to control the scale and direction of the conflict. One of the key reasons Iran's threat is so dangerous is that the country has developed a complex and layered military strategy. Tehran does not rely on traditional large-scale forces alone. It has invested heavily in missile technology, drones, and cyber capabilities. Iran also has a network of allied militias and proxy groups across the region, from Iraq and Syria to Lebanon and Yemen. This means that even if the U.S. strikes Iranian forces directly, Iran can retaliate through indirect attacks carried out by these allied groups. In other words, Iran can make war without officially declaring war, which makes the situation even more unpredictable. Another major factor is the location of U.S. bases in the Middle East. Many of them are close to sensitive areas, such as the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. These are strategic choke points for global oil shipping and military logistics. If Iran targets a base in this region, the effects could spread quickly, affecting shipping lanes, global oil prices, and the security of neighboring nations. The economic impact alone would be significant, and that's part of why the U.S. takes such threats seriously. The tension between the U.S. and Iran has also been shaped by a history of miscalculation. There have been times when both sides thought they could intimidate the other without triggering a wider conflict. But the problem is that in a high-stakes environment, a single mistake or misunderstanding can lead to a major escalation. A missile that misses its target, a drone that is misidentified, or a base that responds too aggressively can all lead to a chain reaction. Once that chain reaction starts, it can be nearly impossible to stop. It is also important to understand the political context inside Iran. The country's leadership faces internal pressures from economic hardship, social unrest, and a population that has grown increasingly frustrated with the government's failure to improve living conditions. In this situation, leaders may use external threats to rally public support and shift attention away from domestic problems. By positioning themselves as defenders of the nation, they can strengthen their political legitimacy. This is a common tactic in authoritarian or highly controlled political systems, where external conflict can be used to unify the population. On the American side, U.S. leaders also face political pressure. The U.S. has a long history of responding to attacks on its military with force. Any perceived weakness could be criticized domestically, especially by political opponents and the media. Additionally, the U.S. is responsible for protecting its allies in the region. If Iran attacks a base, it could also be interpreted as a threat to regional stability and to the safety of allied nations. The U.S. cannot ignore that without risking its credibility as a global power. So why would Iran threaten a U.S. base now? One reason is that Iran may believe the U.S. is distracted by other global issues, such as conflicts in Europe or tensions with China. Iran could see this as an opportunity to assert itself and push back against American influence. Another reason is that Iran might be testing the limits of U.S. tolerance, trying to see how far it can go before the U.S. responds. This is a risky game because it assumes that the U.S. will not escalate, But history has shown that misjudging America's response can be catastrophic. The most dangerous aspect of Iran's threat is that it creates a scenario where both sides feel they must act to protect their reputation and strategic interests. When national pride and military credibility are on the line, leaders may take actions that are more extreme than they would otherwise choose. This is the classic trap of escalation. Each side increases its pressure, and each step makes it harder to back down without losing face. That is why Iran threatening a U.S. base is not just a headline, it is a sign of a crisis that could spiral out of control. To understand why Iran threatening a U.S. base is such a serious matter, we need to look at the history of U.S.-Iran relations. This relationship has been hostile for decades, ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed. Since then, both countries have been involved in a constant cycle of confrontation and retaliation. The U.S. has imposed severe economic sanctions on Iran, targeted its leaders and military assets, and supported rival nations in the region. Iran, in turn, has supported anti-American militias and used proxy groups to attack U.S. interests. This long history means that any threat is not isolated. It is part of a larger pattern of escalation. Iran's military strategy relies heavily on the idea of deterrence. Tehran believes that if it can demonstrate the ability to hit U.S. bases or interests, the U.S. will be forced to think twice before attacking Iran directly. Iran has invested heavily in ballistic missiles and drones, and it has built a powerful network of proxies in the region. This allows Iran to create a cost for the U.S. that goes beyond direct confrontation. The goal is to make the U.S. understand that any attack on Iran will result in a serious and prolonged response. In that sense, Iran's threats are meant to be a warning. If you strike us, we will strike back. But the problem with deterrence is that it requires credibility. If Iran threatens to attack a U.S. base and then does not follow through, its deterrence loses strength. On the other hand, if Iran actually attacks, it risks provoking a much larger war. This is why the situation is so tense. Iran must maintain credibility, but it also must avoid starting a war that it cannot win. This balancing act is incredibly difficult, especially when both sides are dealing with internal political pressure and external threats. Another factor that complicates this is the role of allies and regional powers. The Middle East is a complex web of alliances and rivalries. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE have a strong interest in limiting Iran's influence. They view Iran as a major threat to their security and regional dominance. If Iran attacks a U.S. base, these nations may push the U.S. to respond forcefully because they fear Iran's growing power. At the same time, countries like Russia and China may view the situation differently, and they may use it as an opportunity to increase their influence in the region. This makes the conflict not just a U.S.-Iran issue, but a global strategic crisis. Iran also understands the value of psychological warfare. Threats of attacking a U.S. base create fear and uncertainty. They force the U.S. military to increase security, divert resources, and heighten readiness. This has a cost. It also affects the morale of both military personnel and civilians. When people feel that a conflict is likely, they begin to worry about their safety and the stability of the region. This kind of pressure can influence political decisions, and that is exactly what Iran is trying to do. However, the real question is, would Iran actually attack a U.S. base? The answer is not simple. Iran has a history of using proxy groups to carry out attacks, which gives it plausible deniability. In the past, attacks on U.S. bases or interests have been blamed on groups like the Houthis in Yemen or militias in Iraq. Iran can support these groups without openly declaring war. This strategy allows Iran to respond to U.S. actions while avoiding direct confrontation. But it also creates a situation where the U.S. may struggle to identify the true source of an attack. This ambiguity is dangerous because it can lead to miscalculation. If a proxy group attacks a U.S. base, the U.S. may assume Iran is behind it, even if Iran did not directly order the attack. That assumption could lead to retaliation against Iran, which could then trigger a real war. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of the conflict, the risk of misinterpretation. In a high-tension environment, leaders often assume the worst, and that can lead to a cycle of retaliation. There is also the issue of timing. Iran may threaten a U.S. base at a moment when it believes the U.S. is politically weak or distracted. For example, during election years or periods of domestic unrest, the U.S. may be less willing to engage in a new conflict. Iran may see this as an opportunity to push the boundaries of what it can do. But this strategy is risky because the U.S. may still respond, even if it is reluctant. The U.S. has a long-standing policy of protecting its military assets, and any attack on a base would likely trigger a response regardless of political timing. Another key point is the economic impact of an attack. The Middle East is a major source of global oil, and any conflict can disrupt supply routes and increase prices. If Iran attacks a U.S. base, it could also threaten shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. Even the threat of such action can cause panic in global markets. That is why countries around the world watch this situation closely. A war between the US and Iran would not only affect the region, but could have global economic consequences. The role of international diplomacy also matters. The US and Iran have had moments where negotiations seem possible, especially around the nuclear deal. However, those efforts have repeatedly failed due to mistrust and conflicting demands. If the US and Iran were to resume diplomatic talks, it could reduce the risk of conflict. But threats of attacking a US base make diplomacy harder. When one side is openly threatening the other, it becomes difficult to negotiate in good faith. This is why rhetoric matters. Words can be the first step toward war, especially when they are delivered by powerful leaders with military capability. Finally, the most important question is, what would happen if Iran actually carried out an attack? The US has powerful military capabilities and would likely respond with force. But war is not just about military power. It is about strategy, logistics, alliances, and public support. A conflict with Iran could drag on for months or even years, involving not only direct clashes, but also cyber attacks, economic sanctions, and proxy battles across the region. This would be devastating for both sides and could destabilize the entire Middle East. To understand the full danger of Iran threatening a US base, we also need to consider the role of the US military strategy in the region. The US has built a network of bases and alliances across the Middle East to protect its interests, support allies, and prevent hostile powers from gaining control. These bases are not just military sites, they are symbols of American influence and a key part of the global security system. When Iran threatens one of these bases, it is challenging not only a military asset, but also the US role as a regional power. This is why the US cannot treat such threats lightly. The US military has invested heavily in defense systems to protect its bases. This includes missile defense systems, advanced radar, and rapid response forces. However, Iran has developed ways to test these defenses. Iran's missile technology has improved, and it has used drones and missile strikes in the past to target regional assets. Even if the US intercepts some attacks, the cost of maintaining constant readiness is high. The military must remain vigilant, and the psychological pressure on troops is significant. It also forces the US to divert resources that could be used elsewhere, such as in other global hotspots. The risk is not only direct attack, but also a gradual escalation. Iran could start with smaller actions, like harassing shipping in the Gulf or supporting attacks on allied bases through proxies. These actions may seem limited, but they create a pattern that can lead to a larger conflict. The US might respond with limited strikes, which Iran could then interpret as justification for a larger retaliation. This is the classic tit-for-tat cycle. Each side responds to the other, and the conflict grows in size and intensity. That is why it is so dangerous when a nation publicly threatens military action. It sets a path toward escalation that is hard to stop. Another major issue is the role of Iran's leadership and internal politics. Iran's supreme leader and political elite must balance the demands of hardliners and more moderate factions. Hardliners often push for stronger resistance against the US, while moderates may seek diplomatic solutions to avoid war. When tensions rise, hardliners can gain more influence because they appear more decisive and patriotic. This makes it harder for Iran to back down from threats. Once a threat is made publicly, it becomes difficult to reverse without losing credibility. This is a common issue in international politics. Leaders are forced to follow through on statements to maintain domestic support. The US also faces domestic political challenges. The American public is often tired of foreign wars and may oppose a new conflict. However, when a US base is attacked, public opinion can shift quickly in favor of retaliation. Political leaders must balance the desire to avoid war with the need to protect American soldiers and national interests. This is a difficult balance, and it can lead to rushed decisions. The fear of being seen as weak can push leaders toward military action, even if a diplomatic solution might be possible. This is why threats like Iran-S are so dangerous. They can force a reaction that might otherwise be avoided. A key element of this conflict is the role of technology. Modern warfare is not only about tanks and planes, it involves cyber attacks, electronic warfare, and satellite surveillance. Iran has invested in cyber capabilities and has shown the ability to disrupt infrastructure. If Iran threatens a US base, it could also mean threats to communications and cyber networks. The US relies heavily on digital systems for command and control, and a cyber attack could disrupt operations without a single missile being fired. This adds another layer of danger because cyber warfare is difficult to attribute and even harder to respond to without escalating. One of the most significant dangers is the possibility of miscalculation. In high-tension environments, mistakes happen. A missile could be fired accidentally, a drone could be misidentified, or a base could respond to a false alarm. Once a conflict begins, it can be very difficult to stop. Both sides may believe they are acting defensively, but the other side may see it as an act of war. This is how many conflicts start, not with a deliberate decision for war, but with a mistake or misunderstanding. That is why leaders must be extremely careful when making threats or responding to threats. International reaction is also important. When Iran threatens a U.S. base, other countries respond in different ways. Some may support Iran's right to defend itself, while others will condemn the threat. This can affect global diplomacy and alliances. If the international community supports the U.S., it strengthens America's position. If countries remain neutral or support Iran, it can isolate the U.S. and make the situation more complex. This is especially true for global powers like Russia and China, which may use the conflict to challenge American influence. They may provide diplomatic cover or economic support to Iran, making it harder for the U.S. to act alone. The economic consequences of a conflict must also be considered. A war between the U.S. and Iran could disrupt global oil supply and cause prices to spike. This would affect not only the Middle East, but also the entire world. High oil prices can lead to inflation, economic slowdown, and political instability in many countries. This is why many nations are watching this conflict closely. Even if the U.S. and Iran try to limit the conflict, the economic effects could still be severe. The global economy is interconnected, and any major disruption in the Middle East can have far-reaching consequences. In addition, the humanitarian impact would be devastating. War in the Middle East has already caused immense suffering in countries like Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. A new conflict could create more displacement, more casualties, and more instability. It could also strengthen extremist groups that thrive in chaos. This is another reason why a war would be a disaster, not just for the US and Iran, but for the entire region. The human cost of war is often underestimated in political debates, but it is the most important factor to consider. Finally, we must consider what happens after conflict. Even if the U.S. wins militarily, the long-term consequences could be severe. Iran is a large country with a resilient population and a complex political system. A military victory would not necessarily mean stability. It could lead to a prolonged insurgency, more regional conflict, and increased anti-American sentiment. This is why many experts argue that diplomacy is the only sustainable solution. Threats and military actions may provide short-term advantages, but they do not solve the underlying issues. As the threat of an attack on a U.S. base continues to circulate in the news, the question is not only whether Iran will act, but what happens if it does. A direct attack on a U.S. base would trigger a serious and immediate response. The U.S. would likely act quickly to protect its personnel and assets, and to send a message that such attacks will not be tolerated. But even if the U.S. responds decisively, the conflict would not end there. Iran has shown that it is willing to fight a long, indirect war through proxies and unconventional tactics. The U.S. could strike Iranian targets, but Iran could retaliate through militias in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. That would expand the conflict across multiple countries and make it much harder to control. In addition, the U.S. would also need to consider the risk of escalation beyond the region. Iran has relationships with other powerful nations, and a conflict could draw in outside actors. Russia and China, for example, may use the situation to challenge U.S. influence and strengthen their own strategic position. Meanwhile, Israel could feel threatened and take action of its own. When multiple nations are involved, the conflict becomes more complex and more dangerous. It could shift from a regional conflict into a global crisis. That is why every move in this situation must be calculated carefully. The biggest mistake Iran could make is underestimating the consequences of attacking a U.S. base. The United States has unmatched military power and a history of responding forcefully to attacks on its forces. A strike on a U.S. base would not be a small incident. It would be a major escalation. The U.S. would likely target key Iranian military assets, including missile sites, command centers, and strategic infrastructure. That could severely damage Iran's military capability and further isolate it internationally. Even if Iran believes it can survive a U.S. response, the long-term consequences would be severe. However, the U.S. must also avoid making its own mistakes. Responding too aggressively could trigger a wider war that neither side wants. A limited strike could escalate into something far larger, especially if Iran retaliates through proxies. That is why the U.S. must have a clear strategy and a clear goal. If the goal is to deter Iran, then a strong and targeted response might be enough. But if the goal is to destroy Iran's military capability, that would lead to a much larger conflict. The U.S. must balance the need to protect its forces with the need to avoid an uncontrolled escalation. Another major mistake would be ignoring the human cost. War in the Middle East has already caused immense suffering, and another conflict would only add to that. Civilians would be caught in the crossfire, and infrastructure could be destroyed. The humanitarian impact would be severe, and it would likely create more refugees and more instability. That is why diplomacy must always remain an option. Even when threats are made, dialogue is still possible. Negotiations may not solve every problem, but they can't prevent a catastrophic war. One key point to remember is that threats often reveal weakness more than strength. When a nation publicly threatens an attack, It may be trying to cover up internal problems or to distract from domestic failures. Iran has faced economic hardship, protests, and political instability. By focusing attention on an external enemy, the government can rally public support. But this is a dangerous tactic because it can lead to unintended consequences. Threats can become self-fulfilling prophecies if the other side responds aggressively. That is why leaders must be careful about the language they use and the actions they take. At the same time, the United States must be careful not to fall into the trap of overconfidence. The US has powerful military technology, but Iran has shown it can adapt and use asymmetric tactics effectively. Iran's missile and drone programs, its network of proxies, and its cyber capabilities give it a range of tools for retaliation. The US must take these threats seriously and prepare for the possibility of unconventional attacks. Overconfidence can lead to mistakes that escalate the conflict further. If both sides want to avoid war, the only realistic path is diplomacy backed by credible deterrence. The US must communicate clearly that attacks on its bases will not be tolerated, but it must also leave room for negotiation. Iran must understand that it cannot achieve its goals through threats and violence alone. Both sides need to find a way to reduce tension without losing face. This could involve a gradual de-escalation plan, confidence-building measures, or even a return to negotiations on nuclear and regional issues. It will not be easy, but it is the only way to avoid disaster. The truth is that a war between the US and Iran would be a disaster for everyone involved. It would cause immense human suffering, destabilize the region, and disrupt the global economy. It would also strengthen extremist groups that thrive in chaos. That is why the stakes are so high. A single mistake, a miscalculation, or a rushed decision could ignite a war that nobody wants, but everyone fears. Iran threatening to attack a US base is a warning sign. It is a reminder that the world is walking a dangerous line. In the end, the biggest mistake would be underestimating the power of escalation. Threats and actions can quickly turn into a chain reaction. Once that reaction starts, it becomes almost impossible to stop. That is why both sides must act with restraint and wisdom. Iran should understand that attacking a US base would be a major escalation with severe consequences. The US should also understand that a hasty or overly aggressive response could lead to a wider war. The only way out of this crisis is through careful diplomacy, credible deterrence, and a willingness to avoid unnecessary conflict. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more updates.